Okay, so welcome back to the second half of this morning's class. So we're going to be looking at the Buddha's teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And for those of you who haven't come across this teaching before, just a bit of background for it. So this is pretty much the first teaching that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. So shortly after he was enlightened, he was looking for someone to whom he could communicate his enlightenment experience, and someone who might benefit from hearing that. And he thought of several people, his previous meditation teachers, but unfortunately they had both died. And he then thought of going or finding the five men who were his companions prior to his enlightenment, when he was practicing asceticism to an extreme, and they were supporting him. But they abandoned him when he gave up on the ascetic practices, when he realized that that wasn't the path to enlightenment. But these five companions left him. Anyway, the Buddha thought that they would possibly benefit, that they would be able to hear and understand and realize what it was that the Buddha had realized. So he sought them out. He eventually found them, and after some persuasion, they decided they would listen to him. And part of that initial teaching was this statement of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths themselves are an expression of the very basic understanding that the Buddha gained at his enlightenment, which is that we call conditionality, dependent origination, if you like. This realization that all things arise in dependence upon conditions and change or cease when those conditions change or cease. And arising out of that understanding came this expression of the Four Noble Truths. So if we could have the first slide up, please. So these are the Four Noble Truths. Again, those of you who are familiar with them will probably know them as the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, and so on. I decided to use the original term, which is dukkha, because the word suffering in some ways can be quite limiting in how we understand these truths. We tend to think of suffering as being something quite extreme, something quite severe. What the Buddha was teaching us was more subtle than that, I think. Yes, it does include severe, genuine, what we would call suffering, but it extends over a much wider range of experience than that. So this word dukkha perhaps can more generally be translated as unsatisfactoriness or discomfort or ill at ease, something like that. It has that whole range of meanings, from quite subtle and maybe difficult to detect feelings of discomfort, mental, psychological, as well as physical, right through to what we understand as the extremes of suffering. So throughout this morning, I'm going to be using this term dukkha just to try to encompass that breadth of what we're talking about. So the first truth is that our existence is characterized by this dukkha, that throughout our existence we will experience dukkha. It's unavoidable. It's something that comes with being a human being, if you like. And no matter how pleasant our circumstances may seem to be, we may have a fantastic job, well paid, live in a lovely big house, be able to afford a new car every other year, go on several holidays a year, well, pre-pandemic anyway. We may have all the material things, and it may appear on the outside that we have a comfortable life. What problems could there be? And yet there can still be the experience of dukkha, of something not right, something that we're not comfortable with, that happiness doesn't come from those material possessions. To give it a topical reference, we could just look at, for example, at recent events on the media surrounding Meghan and Harry, two people that, in a material sense, would seem to have everything that most people could possibly wish for, and yet two people that are deeply unhappy on another level. So, yes, dukkha extends over all of our experience, and we can't just draw conclusions from what's on the surface. Underneath, for all of us, there is this, in one way or another, this experience of dukkha. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So in his original teaching, the Buddha identified these 7 types or categories of dukkha, if you like. And so we have birth, old age, sickness, death as dukkha, as unsatisfactory in many ways, and I'm sure we can relate to these quite easily. That there is the physical pain and suffering that goes with these stages of life. In something we're all familiar with, sickness. Many of us are getting more familiar with old age. And eventually death, of course, is inescapable. And all of that brings physical dukkha, but it also brings a lot of emotional, mental dukkha, unsatisfactoriness with it. We may wonder, well, why do we have to get sick? Why do we have to suffer this illness? Shouldn't we be entitled to a healthy, fit life? We resist the fact that that these experiences are all part and parcel of life. But in addition to these more evident causes of dukkha, also perhaps there's the what we might call the mental or the emotional causes of dukkha. So being in contact with what we dislike gives rise to dukkha. We don't want it. We don't want to be in touch with that. We'd rather be in contact with what we like. But unfortunately, we're separated from what we like. So again, that causes us pain. And not to get what we desire. To want something and not be able to have it can be an extremely uncomfortable, unpleasant experience, one that we resist. So we have these 7 categories of dukkha, and Sangha in his book on the Noble Eightfold Path brings out also 4 types of concealed dukkha that we might not recognize immediately, and that's on the next slide. So Sangha points out these 4 other types of dukkha that we can all experience. So something pleasant for ourselves may involve dukkha for others. So maybe an example of that is that we may get pleasure from being able to go into high street shops in town and buy cheap clothing that may be made on the other side of the world, in not very good conditions, with very low paid workers, perhaps even with child labor being used. So we have the pleasure of being able to buy these goods, but other people suffer in the production of them. And although we don't directly see that suffering, it is possible that we're kind of aware of it in the back of our minds, that when we buy these really cheap items, we know that it's not possible really, for those things to be produced, transported around the world, and then sold to us at such low prices without somebody paying the price for it somewhere along the line. And that can be unsettling. It could niggle away at our conscience. It could cause us to have some sort of regret about, the consumer lifestyle we're leading, which benefits us but causes pain for other people. Then there's the pleasant experience that we're afraid of losing. And one particular example of this might be the pleasure that one gets from, for example, being in a position of authority or power, of having status. And whilst we may feel it's good to have that, at the same time one is afraid of losing it. And so the pleasure is diminished by the fear that it may not always be there, that we can't count on it. And of course that applies to probably most of the things that we enjoy, that at the back of our mind is an awareness that this can't last, that it will change. And in a way that that diminishes the pleasure that we get from it. I think quite a telling example of that is, that you may go visit some friends for a meal, they have a dinner party or something like that, and the hostess serves up a beautiful, delicious meal, puts a big pot on the table, and serves everyone. And you're tucking into this food and really, really enjoying it, getting a lot of pleasure from it. But about halfway through your meal, you're starting to think about how nice it would be to have a second helping. And so you glance at what's left in the pot on the table, and you do a quick assessment of how much is there, and then quick scan around the table, looking at all the other people and see, well, how many of those are close to finishing what they're eating, and what if they all want a second portion? Am I going to get a second portion as well? So to make sure of you getting your second portion, you start hurrying what you've got left to eat. And suddenly all the pleasure from what you were eating is gone, because you're simply focused on getting through it as quickly as possible so you can get some more. So there's that pleasant experience that we're afraid of losing, and the fear of that actually destroys the pleasure that we're getting in the first place. The third aspect of this concealed dukkha is something pleasant that binds us to something that brings dukkha, that brings unsatisfactoriness. One could think of the body. So our bodies can be a source of pleasure for us. But of course, at the same time, our bodies will get sick, will get old, and will cease to function, will die. So in order to be able to have the pleasure that the body can provide, we have to accept the downside of all of that as well. And the fourth aspect is that satisfying our senses can never really bring lasting pleasure. That there's something deep within us that longs for more than simply sense satisfaction. And from a Buddhist point of view, that something more is that we long for what we call enlightenment. We long for the spiritual path and for its completion in enlightenment. And anything less than that is always going to feel somewhat unsatisfactory, not entirely fulfilling. Okay, I think we're done with that slide. Thanks. So the second noble truth is the origin, the truth of the origin of our dukkha. And put simply, in one word, it's craving. So the Buddha identified that our dukkha arises because basically we want things to be other than they are. And it doesn't really matter how things are, we still want them to be different. So if things are not going well for us, if we're going through difficulties, we're experiencing painful situations, then we want to be rid of that. We want it to be over. We want it to be gone. We want something better. If we're experiencing good times, things are going well, we're happy, we have all that we need for now, but we understand, we know on some level that that won't last, that it doesn't last, and we want it to last. And so our craving there is for something to continue that can't continue. So, yeah, summing it up, we can say that it's craving for things to be other than they are is the cause of our dukkha. We want things to last when all things are impermanent. Nothing lasts forever. We want the bad times to go away, although that simply cannot be. Life is full of ups and downs. No one can go through life simply experiencing the ups. We all have to have the downside at some point and to some extent in our life. And so it's this craving, this desire that causes us discomfort, causes us unsatisfactoriness, causes us to always be wanting for something or other. So the third noble truth, just in case this was all sounding a bit depressing and you're beginning to wonder, well, what's the point of anything? So if we could, the third noble truth is, oh, sorry, I've jumped a slide. Well, there isn't a slide in there for the third noble truth. The third noble truth is simply that this dukkha can be brought to an end. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all terrible. And what's the point of anything? That actually we can bring this this cycle of craving and dukkha to an end. So the Buddha tells us that there is an escape from it. And the end of dukkha can be achieved through our own efforts in this very lifetime. So we all have the potential to become enlightened, to go beyond craving and beyond dukkha, beyond the pain and suffering that's inherent in our existence. So that's the good news. And the final truth, the fourth noble truth, which is the next slide, thanks Ed, is the way that leads to the cessation of dukkha. And that way is called the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail this morning because this is the subject matter of the next 8 weeks of this Saturday morning class. So I'm just going to sort of look at it in summary, as it were. So we have these 8 stages or steps in the path. I've put there right or perfect for each one because the path has 2 aspects to it. It's what we might call the mundane Eightfold Path and the transcendental Eightfold Path. So the mundane Eightfold Path is where we would find ourselves. It's a practice that we do in order to move us towards enlightenment and to ultimately gain enlightenment. And that's described as right vision, right emotion, etc. There's then the path as experienced by an enlightened being, by an enlightened mind. And for that, we use the phrase perfect vision, perfect emotion, etc. I put that up because if you happen to come across Sangha's book on the Eightfold Path, which in its earlier incarnations was called Vision and Transformation, you'll find that Sangha uses this term perfect vision. And other people writing about the Eightfold Path, you might find writing about right vision, etc. And that's the 2 different aspects. So when one is approaching it on the level of the mundane path, as a path of practice that we engage in, then we would call it right vision, etc. With an aim, an aspiration towards developing perfect vision, perfect emotion, as the goal of the process, if you like. Now, you may have come across in our classes the threefold path, which we often talk about, the path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And now I'm talking about an eightfold path, and what's going on there? Are there 2 different paths? If so, which one do I follow? And no, this is the answer. There aren't 2 different paths. They're just 2 different ways of looking at the same path. So on the next slide, I have the threefold path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom on the left there, and the stages of the Eightfold Path that relate to that. So the Eightfold Path maps onto the threefold path quite easily, as one would expect, because the path is the path. Just to avoid any potential confusion in case you've come across one model and weren't aware how this other model fits onto it. Okay, so I think that's probably all I've got to say. Oh, just one or two things to add. About the Four Noble Truths, or in particular this experience of dukkha. Buddhism has been accused of being very gloomy, very depressing, and focusing all on pain and suffering. It's not that Buddhism or the Buddha denied the existence of pleasure. In fact, far from it. The Buddha emphasized that that we need pleasure, wholesome pleasure in our lives. So it's not that we don't or can't experience joyful things, pleasant things. I'm sure we all have pleasant, joyful experiences in our life. The problem is, of course, when we try to cling on to them, when we don't recognize or don't want to recognize their impermanent nature. And then that brings us right back to the second noble truth about craving being the source of our dukkha, of our pain. It's when we experience the pleasure and we want to hang on to it, we want it to last, and we then cause ourselves pain because, of course, it can't last. But certainly pleasure is there. Certainly pleasure is to be enjoyed as it arises, but not craved for, not going out of our way to seek pleasure for its own sake. And just to come back briefly to the Eightfold Path, so it's set out as an 8-stage path, but it's not that we develop it in a linear way. It's not that we start at the beginning and steadily work our way down the 8 stages, completing each one and ticking the box as we go. It's more like that we work on different areas of the path at different times, and gradually over a lifetime we work on the whole path, and we develop all of the stages, sometimes maybe working on 1 or 2 stages, other times working on other stages, but overall we develop the whole path together as it's sort of in unison, really, that we bring it all up at the same time. I sometimes use the analogy of like a 1980s music center, where you had all the different slide controls for different frequencies of sound, from bass to treble and everything in between, and you could play around with the sliders, moving them up and down. It's a bit like that, that each stage of the path is like one of those sliders, and we can move one up, and then we can move another one up, and then we can bring a third one up, and so on. So yes, the goal is to develop all aspects of the path equally over time.